Sorry. Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Raghuram Raju from University of Hyderabad. We are going to discuss today the module on Tagore, the home and the world, on patriotism and cosmopolitanism. The module is written by Professor Bindu Puri of University of Delhi. Tagore is a great poet and a Nobel laureate, but along with being a poet, he also wrote some important books that deal with social and political issues. And this is one of the remarkable things that is associated with Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore as he is fondly called. In one of his now famous book called Nationalism, Tagore argues that nationalism has some inherent evils and he rejects the idea of nationalism. These are delivered as lectures in Japan and other places, and they have become very popular. And as I mentioned, that he is very critical about nation and nationalism. There are many people who find Tagore arguing that India has never had a real sense of nationalism. So this is something which is very important to note, that India does not have a notion of nationalism, and Tagore rejected the idea of nationalism, particularly Western nationalism, and he said that nation is a source of untruth and a loss of individual freedom. So for him, nation does not have an idea of truth, and it comes heavily in compromising about individual freedom. Tagore argued against the concept of nation and ideology of patriotism, also in his other book, The Home and the World, and this also comes up very clearly in his debate with Gandhi when he opposed Gandhi's call for non-cooperation movement. He found that the moment you ask non-cooperating the Western with his British Raj, it implicitly assumes that you are different from them, and that is not acceptable to him. This also comes very clearly in his letters to C.F. Andrews. So all these things led many people argue that Tagore advocated a form of cosmopolitanism, the idea that all human beings are world citizens and owe primary allegiance to the world community. The discussion of this topic can have two different angles. One angle is that idea of nation in India, the Indian nationalism, is derived from the Western nationalism, and this idea is very clearly and prominently expounded by Partha Chatterjee in his famous book, Nationalist Thought and Colonial World, a Derivative Discourse. What we are going to discuss is the other angle, namely, there is an important article written by Martha Nussbaum, who claims that most of the political philosophers from the West necessarily assumed the idea of a nation, and then she finds in contrast in Tagore a rejection of this idea of nation, and then she finds in Tagore universalism. Tagore's position against nationalism was not an argument in support of world citizenship. The argument against nationalism was a part of Tagore's general opposition to organized collectivities. Tagore argued that the coercion of the unique individual into an organized collective, whether nation, national movement, caste, varna, or organized religion, went against the individual's freedom to think and act. That is, for Tagore, any organized institution of any brand will compromise on the individual's expression of freedom. So Tagore's argument against organized collectivity was also apparent in Tagore's idea of religion of man, which leaned towards simple folk religion rather than institutionalized religion with theological structures. So Tagore was not in favor of any organized religion. At the same time, Tagore was not saying that individuals should live outside society in an anarchic state. Rather, he comes up with a third alternative where he finds that individual can express their freedom in a smaller community, in a folk community, which is manageable and does not come on the way of expressing one's freedom. So there are two things here. One, Tagore is against all organized societies, social institutions, or religions or religious institutions. His main focus is to see that individuals express their freedom. That's where he finds the task of human life. At the same time, he is not talking about individuals living outside society. Individuals live inside society, but those societies are small folk kind of societies which are manageable. Another dimension to this debate is to contrast Tagore's critique of nation with his claim of egoless concept of human being. That is, Tagore is not saying that I reject nationalism and I would watch for the individualism and the self-interest associated with individualism, as perhaps is a doctrine or theory that is advocated by liberals. Seen from this point of view, Tagore's view can be extrapolated to posit a necessary relation between self-centered or egoistic individualism who form into a collectivity called the nation. So he finds in Western nationalism two important constituencies, namely there is a self-centered, self-regarding virtue kind of human being, and that human being becomes a part of a larger collective called the nation. He will find them as related to each other. In contrast, Tagore's rejection of the idea of nation is related to his rejection of both self-centered idea of individualism and the nation as a collective. This critique of all institutions comes very clearly in his fiction, particularly in his work, the play, The Kingdom of Cards, which can be reconstructed as a literary critique of caste and varna. Tagore points in all these cases the same point, that is, the original vocation or essential nature of man was his individuality. Since all collective unions and movements imposed the majoritarian will on individual, they destroy man's uniqueness and freedom. So Tagore emphasizes in this context that the organized institutions compromise on the expression of individual freedom, which is the fulcrum of human existence. In this context, Tagore used the term dharma, which according to him is, when we know the highest ideal of freedom which a man has, we know his dharma, the essence of his nature, the real meaning of his self, unquote. Just as, to quote him again, The freedom of the seed is in the attainment of its dharma, its nature and destiny of becoming a tree, unquote. So too, the individual's man is absolutely bankrupt if he is deprived of this speciality, this individuality. It is most valuable because it is not universal. In other words, you find in this passage Tagore advocating that individual freedom is the most important aspect that in fact constitutes his dharma. The job of an individual, the task before an individual, is to attain this universal truth through the expression of his or her freedom. That's the most important thing that Tagore envisages. So there are three important aspects that we find in Tagore. One, an individual who lives in a minimal kind of society, a folk society, and then you have the universal, and according to him, that the universals have to be realized. Only then you find that a human being reaches the attainment of his purpose. That's the most important thing. In the process, he rejects two things. One, he rejects all organized institutions or organized religions. He also rejects the selfish notion of individualism. For Tagore, the home of freedom is in the spirit of man. That's the point that he keeps emphasizing. The spirit of man is the expression of freedom. And this expression of freedom gets scuttled, gets abstracted by any majoritarian institution, however massive good they may be. So that's the point that he maintains consistently from beginning to the end. That spirit refuses to recognize any limit to action or to knowledge. It was because he believed that man's true nature, man's true vocation can be attained only by reasoning and acting in freedom that Tagore insists on the rights of the individual to differ from the group and to make mistakes. He says that you should be able to make mistakes and you should learn from these mistakes. Okay, but then no organized institution, no organized individual social institution or religious institution should come on the way of scuttling your expression of freedom. And this, according to Tagore, involves four central aspects, and these come out very clearly in the novel of his, namely The Home and the World. This novel involves four central characters: Bimala, the wife of the landlord Nikhil; Sandeep, his nationalist friend, somewhat inauthentically caught up in the Gandhian movement for Swaraj; Nikhil, the enlightened landlord who freely supports some of the movements in his own capacity but rejects the coercion of dissenting others into the movement; and Nikhil's widowed sister-in-law, the Bada Rani. Ghare Bhaire makes a life-like portrayal of the difficulties of negotiating a relationship with the world when one is suddenly pulled out of the comforts of the home, a metaphor for the traditional communities of pre-modern India. In the story, Bimala is passionately attracted to Sandeep and his nationalistic fervor, and this makes her transgress the boundaries of her role as the Choti Rani in the traditional Zamindari household of her husband. Nikhil loves his country and supports Gandhian Swadeshi in his personal capacity. However, he refuses to coerce anyone into following Gandhian principles and sacrificing their livelihood for the national movement. He tries to bring out Bimala from the confinements of the traditional life she has led and educate her into a freedom in the mind. Through Nikhil, Tagore argues that enlightenment or modernity is not constituted by a complete or unreasonable rejection of one's own past or tradition, but lies in the cultivation of a state of mind. This is the state of mind where the individual assumes responsibility by the very freedom of his or her beliefs in both the old and the new. Individual must grow into the ability to think out the reasons for what he or she chooses to believe in and why he or she accepts traditional social rules. Individual human life, it is to be enlightened, free, cannot be a blind following of tradition or a blind rejection of tradition or indeed an unreasoned acceptance of any new idea learned from the West. That is, the point that comes out very clearly here is that you should not blindly follow your tradition. At the same time, you need not reject your tradition. You should rationally negotiate with your tradition. Similarly, you should not blindly follow the Western ideas. You should not reject Western ideas. You should reflect, creatively reflect, rationally reflect, and take what is important and what is not important by making a judgment. Tagore seems to suggest that freedom to reason would not necessarily involve Bimala's rejection of the traditional role, but only a rejection of unreflective ideational confinement in that role. So that is, that if you follow the tradition, you should not blindly follow the tradition. You should, in fact, become reflective about what you are following. If Tagore's rejection of the concept of the nation came from the idea that man should not be limited by country, but should be a world citizen. Given this background about Tagore's views on nation, let us look at one of the important interpretations of Tagore's ideas by Martha Nussbaum. Martha Nussbaum bases her reading of The Home and the World in her essay and concludes that Tagore recommended a primary allegiance to the world community. So, she says that since he rejected nation, he is advocating world community. However, philosophers familiar with Tagore's music, stories, and plays have expressed difficulties with Nussbaum's argument about Tagore's acceptance of a cosmopolitanism derived in the philosophical lineage from Kant. Though Nussbaum is justified in concluding that Tagore rejected nationalism and ethnocentrism, the idea that Tagore embraced a cosmopolitanism derived from ideas of universal reason is philosophically not acceptable. Tagore emphasized individual freedom in the mind and accorded a priority to an individual freedom to respond to independent reasons. However, he thought of real or apparent reasons without any prior commitment to a conception of rationality and universal reason. Let us now look at the relation between Tagore and Kant made by these interpreters. The Kantian idea of the world republic with the giant chains of organization policies that would reject local particularities and commitments are irrelevant, and this would be not acceptable to Tagore. In other words, unlike Kant, Tagore gives importance to smaller communities and folk communities and things like that, whereas Kant will not accept any such pre-modern communities. This is the clear difference between Kant and Tagore. So the comparing Tagore with Kant will not hold good. Consequently, it is difficult to accept Nussbaum's conclusion that being an Indian or a Bengali was a morally irrelevant attribute for Tagore, and that, in his view, man was better defined as a world citizen. That is not true. Tagore does talk about universalism, but that universalism is not bereft of cultural moorings. As a poet, culture plays a very important role in the writings and life of Tagore. So we will see that in this, it is seen from this point of view. While it is true that Tagore rejected nation, he is not a person who will fit into the cosmopolitan interpretation advocated by Martha Nussbaum. That's the point that we need to keep in mind. So now let us summarize the discussion, by recalling some important aspects that are there in the module and that are also there outside the module. So let us look at what is happening to Tagore in relation to his critique of nationalism and what is attributed to him, namely cosmopolitanism. What is important to look here is that Tagore rejected the idea of nation, and he found that the nation by its very nature does not allow a complete expression of individual freedom. And subsequently, you can see that he is in fact outside the thesis of how, for instance, Indian nation is derived from Western nation, a point made by Partha Chatterjee. Tagore would say that don't derive the idea of nation from the West, and he would find fault in India's attempt to become a nation. He would say that is not a good path. You know why? Because nation for him does not stand for truth. It will not enable people to express their freedom, which is very important aspects of human existence according to Tagore. Now, another feature that is very important to note here is, unlike the Western notion of nation, where all pre-modern communities must be dismantled, must be destroyed to institute a new institution in a new, entirely new platform, a kind of a tabula rasa of the Lockean type, you need to reject the past. Tagore does not accept this position. According to him, past is important, the folk cultures are important, but the past or folk cultures or tradition should not be followed blindly. They should be understood through a reflection, and they should be adjudicated why we are following what we are following. This rational engagement with the past is what distinguishes Tagore from other nationalists, both in India and outside. So recalling the past is one of the important things, but this recalling is not to romanticize the past, not to blindly accept the past, but to rationally engage with it, critically engage with it. In the critical engagement, one might incorporate some good things about the past, reasonable things about the past, and reject some unreasonable or bad things from the past. So this is the most important element that we find not only in Tagore but also in other people, though they each one try to engage with the past differently. For instance, Tagore engages it in a particular way, Vivekananda engages it in another way, Sri Aurobindo engages it in another way, Ambedkar engages it in another way, and Gandhi engages it another way. So there is a different way through which these people engage with the past. But what is important is almost all contemporary Indian thinkers recall the past. They engage with the past. I hope you understand the contents that are covered in this module, which consists of Tagore's critique or rejection of nation and the interpretation of Tagore's rejection as endorsing Cosmopolitanism by Martha Nussbaum and the kind of a larger background that surrounds Tagore along with other contemporary Indian thinkers. Thank you.